Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia's special panel, virtual event, What Kind of Peace for Ukraine? We will also discuss the future of Europe and of U.S.-European relations. My name is Geneviève Zubrzycki. I'm the Weiser Professor for Europe and Eurasia, Director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, and Professor of Sociology here at the University of Michigan. And today I have the distinct pleasure to host two distinguished guests who will help us make sense of very complicated situation and fast evolving situation in the last few weeks. And so I'd like to welcome Ambassadors Daniel Fried and William B. Taylor. Welcome. I will say a few words now to introduce them to you. Ambassador Daniel Fried is the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council, and he has over 40 years of experience in the Foreign Service and played a key role in designing and implementing American policy in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. As Special Assistant and NSC Senior Director for Presidents Clinton and Bush, as Ambassador to Poland between 1997 and 2000, and also as Assistant Secretary of State for Europe between 2005 and 2009, Ambassador Fried helped craft the policy of NATO enlargement to Central European nations, and in parallel in crafting NATO-Russia relations. Ambassador Fried also helped lead the West's response to Moscow's aggression against Ukraine starting in 2014. As State Department Coordinator for Sanctions Policy, he crafted U.S. sanctions against Russia and negotiated the imposition of similar sanctions by Europe, Canada, Japan, and Australia. Our second guest is Ambassador William B. Taylor, who's Vice President of the Russia and Europe section at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and he has deep expertise on Europe, on Ukraine and Eastern Europe. In the 1990s, Ambassador Taylor coordinated U.S. assistance to the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009, and in 2019, he served as Chargé d'Affaires at the American Embassy in Kyiv. He also has expertise on the Middle East. During the Arab Spring, he oversaw U.S. assistance and support to Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. He served in Jerusalem as the U.S. government's representative to the Mideast Quartet, and he served in Kabul in 2002 and in Baghdad in 2003. Ambassador Taylor is a graduate of West Point and Harvard's Kennedy School, and he served as an infantry platoon leader and combat company commander in the U.S. Army in Vietnam and Germany. So thank you again to both of you for making time in your very busy schedules today to try to make sense of what's going on. And this is especially important because quite a bit has happened since I invited you to participate in this special event. I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. So I will just refresh people's memory. So initially, Ukraine was not invited to a meeting between Russian and American representatives to discuss a potential ceasefire or peace treaty. A rare earth deal was not signed following a shocking meeting in the Oval Office. Following that ill-fated Oval Office meeting between President Zelensky, President Trump, and Vice President J.D. Vance, the UK, the EU members, Turkey, and Canada met in London to discuss war and peace in Ukraine, but also to rethink European security in face of an aggressive Russia and in light also of the Trump administration's shifting foreign policy. Then, a few days ago, the U.S. froze aid to Ukraine. It paused sharing intelligence with Ukraine, and it suspended Ukraine's access to satellite imagery. Yesterday, Russians took, won back some territory around the Kursk area as a result. So how can we make sense of all this? How do you explain the Trump administration's position vis-a-vis Ukraine? And as diplomats, you've been privy to many tense negotiations in the past. So it would really help us if you could demystify perhaps what's going on, or if you could, go beyond what we read in in newspapers or see on TV. Ambassador Fried, is there hope for Ukraine still? And what is the role of diplomacy in ongoing negotiations? We'll start with you, Ambassador Fried.
Yes, there is hope for Ukraine. Trump's plan could work, by which I mean a plan to have a ceasefire more or less along existing lines, plus security for Ukraine. It could work, and indeed, it's the best shot we have of a decent outcome. There's a but coming, which is the Trump administration needs to get behind its own plan and get out of its own way. And to say that the signals are mixed from Washington is to be kind. What I think you are seeing is major policy battles being acted out in front of the world and about the Ukraine issue. I think in the administration, you have different schools of thought competing with each other in a rather rough and ugly fashion. And Ukraine is the victim. But the mercurial nature of this president, and indeed of the administration itself, is some grounds for hope, because a deliberate and consistent strategic abandonment of Ukraine is prelude to a strategic abandonment of Europe, while possible, is not necessarily what's going to happen. And the next chapter of this will be the senior level meeting in Saudi Arabia between Pompeo, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, with the Ukrainian Foreign Minister and Yermak, Chief of Staff. Hopefully, the restrictions on intelligence sharing and tactical intelligence sharing and weapons to Ukraine will be paused, will be lifted. I don't know any of this, but you gave me an easy answer because you said, is there hope? And yes, there is hope. It
So
doesn't.
how likely is it, though, then?
I don't know about odds. Right now, you have some very questionable actors with the loudest voices within the administration. And they are people who don't think we have any interests in Ukraine and precious few interests in Europe. And they even may be tempted by a kind of spheres of influence arrangement for the world. The Yalta School, for those who think that the 1945 summit was a model. But there are others. I think the Reaganite school within the administration has not given up. They may be being shouted down, but the chaos, the mixed signals that the administration is giving is burning through a lot of political capital, and it may be that President Trump doesn't want to do that. The dust up over the weekend between Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski on the one hand and Elon Musk, and even a little bit Marco Rubio on the other, is symptomatic. Musk threatened to suspend Starlink support for Ukraine. Sikorski countered that Poland pays for a good piece of that, and if the United States actually did it, it would cause Poland to rethink its suppliers. Poland buys a lot of U.S. weapons. Elon Musk then said that he had no intention of doing this, and Rubio said that the accusation was completely false. At which point, Sikorski simply pocketed the concession and thanked Rubio. There's been nothing more since. It may be that people in the administration understand that there is a cost if you alienate countries who are otherwise good customers. they spend money on American products. You alienate them, they will spend less money on American products. They will look elsewhere. What is my confidence in my own admittedly optimistic judgment? Low to medium. It's still my judgment, but I'm not going to tell you this is the only outcome. Worse outcomes are possible. But it's in flux. And we should remember that the Trump administration is in a shakedown period that all U.S. administrations go through. This is just more so than usual. And it is possible that Trump's brand of strategic thinking will eventually settle, not because he suddenly discovers the virtues of the free world or a rules-based order or anything like it, but because he realizes the U.S. will make less money if it's fighting with its friends, and he will be seen as a loser with respect to Putin. And finally, Geneviève, I would throw this out as a sign of hope. Trump has said that eventually Putin's also got to give something. Putin, as we know, is not inclined to give anything to anybody. And if he is as arrogant toward Trump as he is toward the Europeans, if he is unyielding, thinking that he can stare down Trump, Trump may react badly, at which point we will push back against the Russians. And there are many ways we can do this. Putin's arrogance could be his downfall. Now, I've gone on at length, and for that, my apologies, but I wanted to give you you've asked the right question. I wanted to give you my reasoned response.
Thank you, Ambassador Taylor.
So following Dan's reasoned response, with which I agree, let me just say that, as Dan has indicated, things in the real world out there in Ukraine and in Russia have not changed. Ukraine is still fighting for its life. It's fighting for its existence. It's fighting for its democratic values that we share. And they continue. Even though, as you said, Geneviève, the cutoff on assistance and cutoff of intelligence sharing and access to satellites, nonetheless, the Ukrainians fight on. They continue to support their president. They continue to push to stop the Russians in Ukraine. And this is in our interest. That continues. The other thing that has not changed is the Russians are still the enemy. The Russians are still the enemy. They are the ones who began this, as we know, unprovoked attack on Ukraine. They continue that. They're taking advantage of this pause in weapons. The weapons pause probably hasn't had real effect on the actual supply on the battlefield yet, but it will. And knowing that it will, the Ukrainians have to be conservative with what they use so that the Russians are taking advantage. The Russians are the enemy, not just to the Ukrainians. The Russians are the enemy for Europeans and indeed for the United States. That said, Dan is right. It is possible that the pressure on President Putin to come to the table could succeed. It is possible that the leverage that the Trump administration has over Putin will force him to come to the table, which he has not yet agreed to do. Putin has said he will be willing to come to the table if the Ukrainians surrender. If the Ukrainians surrender, then yes, he'll come to the table to negotiate the terms of that. That's not a negotiation, and that's not good enough. And so the Trump administration has the opportunity, I would say even the obligation, to put the real pressure on Putin required to get him to the table. And that could still happen. The Ukrainians have indicated all too often that they're willing to make assessments on how they will go forward. They're willing to make some hard decisions. As Dan said, they're likely to have these conversations about these hard decisions with the Americans. with Secretary Rubio and others in Saudi Arabia tomorrow, that will lay the groundwork then for some kind of challenge to Putin. And the way that that is going to have to happen is Putin's going to have to be forced to come to the table to negotiate that challenge. So I agree with Dan. I think it's too soon. It's still possible. It is still possible for this to work. The facts on the ground have not changed. The Ukrainians are continuing to fight, and the Russians are still the enemy.
Geneviève, to jump in,
Mhm.
many of our friends, Bill and I are not in the center of opinion of our own friends. Many of them are more pessimistic. Many of them will blowtorch the Trump administration, and all of their criticisms have a basis. It's not like they're wrong or they're stupid. But I tend not to catastrophize or even to take the worst signs and project them, because see how things can move back. I don't know that it'll be that way with this administration. There are some corners of Trump world that are truly dark. But as long as there's a way forward, I'm going to focus on that. And Geneviève, one last thing. I learned a lot about negotiating tactics from watching the Solidarity people do it in 1989 with the communists. And it was said of Mazowiecki, who became the first non-communist prime minister of Poland since 1939. It was said of him that if he was confronted with a brick wall with a crack in it, all he focused on was the crack, until pretty soon there was no more brick wall. Now, it's not always like 1989. I get it. But that was a lesson I took to heart. Sorry to jump in.
No, thank you. I think that one thing that's, on the one hand, it's good to have your hopeful scenario. On the other hand, I mean, what we both said, that Russia is clearly the aggressor and is responsible for this war. What is mystifying for the American public is the refusal to recognize this publicly by this new administration. So we've seen President Trump, for example, the way that he interacted with President Zelensky, or what, many of his declarations. So, what the people who are in the administration, you're able to assess these different wings, perhaps within the Trump administration. We don't see this, so it's very difficult for us to see that there's something else, going on other than basically the U.S. shifting significantly its foreign policy, if not doing a 180 reversal. So actually, I want to ask you about this. Well, perhaps before I go to thinking about asking you about U.S. Europe relations, perhaps people don't know, but we hosted at the University of Michigan an important symposium at the beginning of December that we co-organized with the Atlantic Council. Both of you were key figures of that. We hosted specialists on and from Ukraine, the US, the UK, France, Finland, Poland, and Russia, to discuss what a fair and durable peace in Ukraine would be. And one of the, I'm sorry to say that some of the recommendations that the group issued to the Trump administration was one essential feature for a peace treaty would be NATO membership, and this is not at all on the table, or is it in your hopeful scenario? So what are the likely scenarios for a ceasefire followed by a peace treaty in the next few weeks or months? And what may be the cost of those plausible scenarios, both for Ukraine and for Europe? Ambassador Taylor, we can start with you.
Geneviève, I'm going to be quick because Dan Fried and Steve Hadley have just written an excellent piece, which I heartily recommend, and you might just put it in the chat. You might just make it available for everybody.
It's in the chat.
It's already in the chat. I recommend people read this because it addresses a couple of your questions, Geneviève. One is how to proceed. I mean, the whole point of Dan and Steve and Frank's paper is how to proceed. It's exactly your question. And one of the four main elements that they talk about is indeed NATO membership. Because in order for there to be a peace, for there to be a durable ceasefire, which you asked about, there needs to be some indication, some way, some guarantee that the Russians will not invade again. A ceasefire can stop the fighting, can stop the shooting for some period of time, but that allows the Russians then, well within Ukraine, they still occupy nearly 20% of Ukrainian territory, allows them to rearm, which they need to do. They are in tough shape right now, the Russians and the Ukrainians. Let's be clear. I mean, both sides are tired, but it allows it without a guarantee that Dan and team talk about. The Russians can go again for Kyiv. They can go again to dominate Ukraine, which is their ultimate goal. That's very, very clear. So it's very important that there be some guarantee. And the best guarantee is the one you asked about, Geneviève, and that is membership in NATO. It's likely to be the cheapest. It's likely to be the most effective. I don't agree that it's off the table at this point. The Ukrainians say it's not off the table. The Russians want it to be off the table, but they don't get a vote. We don't consult with the Russians about whether or not other members, potential members join NATO. They don't get a vote. They get a vote on whether or not to adhere to or abide by a ceasefire, yes, but they don't get a vote on the security guarantee in any form. So I would say that is that's an important component of some kind of a ceasefire.
Are the U.S., Howard, excuse me to cut you off like this, but are the U.S. willing to ask that? I mean, that's the thing. It's off the table because we don't see the current administration wanting to push for that.
The Americans are going to, in the end, have to push for it in order to make it happen. There's no doubt about that. If they do, when they do, Dan indicated right at the end of his comments a moment ago that Putin is very likely to be obstinate, obdurate, to be uncooperative, and not to be willing to sit down and have these conversations which the Trump administration is trying to force. And if they do oppose, and if they do resist this push for a ceasefire with some kind of a security guarantee, then options are back on the table that might not be on the table today.
A footnote to what Bill said, because I agree with him. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said that Ukraine's NATO member, it was unrealistic to think of Ukraine's NATO membership being part of any negotiated agreement. That was taken to mean that he had taken Ukrainian NATO membership off the table. But that's not what he said. What he said was it's not part of a negotiation with Russia, which is true. I'm not saying I would push Donald Trump right now for a decision. But if it's not off the table completely, it's not off the table at all. If the Trump administration is going to consider it, it will have to be with an understanding that there won't be U.S. boots on the ground deployed to Ukraine in any serious numbers, that any boots on the ground would have to be European. But I am actually more optimistic about the possibility of NATO defending Ukraine than I was 5-6 years ago. The Ukrainians have very nearly defended themselves. In fact, they have defended themselves without any allied military intervention whatsoever. They've done it with weapons. That's it. Well, imagine what the campaign would like if they had air cover and anti-aircraft support, area defense, air defense systems. It is possible. I'm not saying we're there, but Bill is talking about a scenario in which the Trump administration and Trump himself shifts because Trump wants a win. Putin denies it to him. And Trump, wants to be the one who saved Ukraine and saved NATO at the same time. And he could do it. He could make that claim. That would be a big deal. Historic figure. Nothing like it before. You could see how Trump might appeal to, that might appeal to Trump. Anyway, that's a thought. I don't know that it is going to be this way, but you're not asking us about that. You're asking us whether there's hope, whether there is a prospect.
Well, I'm asking what are likely scenarios at this point, right? So, okay, you both think that Ukraine's membership into NATO is still, there's still hope for that. What might be other things that, might emerge out of current negotiations for a ceasefire and eventually a peace treaty? Are there, 2 or 3 scenarios that are currently kind of being envisioned?
So there are a couple of things, and again, the Ukrainians have recognized, President Zelensky has recognized that Russia occupies 18% of its territory, of Ukrainian territory. And he has recognized that it would be very, very difficult to try to take that back, take that 18 to 20% that is occupied by the Russians back militarily. That recognition allows for some discussion in these ceasefire conversations about how to deal with that 18-20% of occupied territory. Historians, Dan is a better historian than I, and also a closer observer of European politics, but we all remember East Germany, West Germany, and the West Germans got into NATO, Geneviève, got into NATO and began what became the European Union while they were still separated, while they were still divided, while East Germany was still dominated by the Soviet Union. So the Ukrainians understand that. They remember that very well. And the West Germans made a commitment when they joined NATO that they would not try to take back East Germany militarily. Ukrainians could consider that kind of a commitment as well. So that gives some possibilities that could form the basis of a ceasefire going forward.
Ambassador Freed, do you want to add something to this, or?
Well, lest we be accused of being incurable Panglossian optimists, the Trump people could offer to recognize Russian conquests. In other words, recognize new borders. That would be a terrible mistake. It would run counter to the Trump administration's own policy directive that it would never recognize Russian occupation of Crimea. So that would be a very bad signal, but it's something Trump could just say. He could just say it. And then everybody in the administration would scramble to make it. So that's one bad outcome, right? Not just a ceasefire, but recognition that Putin's going to have that land and it's over. And then pressuring Ukraine to accept it. So that's one bad outcome. It would isolate the United States because there are very few countries. Even the Indians and South Africans are unlikely to go along. It would truly put us in bad company, but I can't rule it out, right? And there is also a non-trivial chance that Trump would simply accept Putin's demands that Ukraine be neutral, that he would accept Putin's nonsense promises. He could do it, and there are many people in his administration who would want to do it because they actually believe that the world ought to be divided up among the great powers. Or they're Asia firsters, and they believe that Ukraine is an overextension. We should rebalance to Asia from Europe. It's possible. The reason I don't think it is likely is because it makes Putin the winner and Trump the loser. And that's what Trump doesn't want. I'm not saying he won't do it. I mean, there are a lot of people in Trump world who believe in trashing Ukraine who have done so. I mean, Elon Musk, Donald Trump Jr., Tucker Carlson, they're not the only ones, though. So the Ukrainians have to play this very smart and understand the risks and the downsides, which are there, right? But I would say that Trump's desire not to be seen as Putin's patsy, Putin's poodle, is a significant factor. But look, we'll see what happens tomorrow. You have Trump don't forget also, Trump loves a cliffhanger. He loves TV drama. He loves having people like us talking about what he's going to do and wondering what he's going to do and placing himself in the spotlight. He may like actual consequences somewhat less. And if he gives up Ukraine, there are actual consequences that will be blamed on him.
There absolutely will be. And I'll just put the point on, put one final point on Dan's great point, which would be Trump. That would be a clear loss for President Trump, for the United States, for Europe, for NATO, a clear loss, much greater loss, Geneviève, than Afghanistan was for President Biden. Much greater. This would be a blemish, a horrible blemish on the Trump administration going forward. And it would be noticed around the world, undeniable. It would be so clear that this would be a loss for the United States and Europe and NATO, not to mention Ukraine.
Well, European leaders are taking the signals from the White House to heart. And so they have, they convened a special meeting in London. President Macron has also, is trying to lead with the UK a rethinking of the defense of Europe. Poland is also very active. So, I mean, what we're seeing, at least from the European side, is that they're taking the different signals that the Trump administration is sending very seriously. So how is the U.S.'s shift in longstanding foreign policy impacting its relations to Europe and reshaping Europe itself? And you mentioned the tension between Musk and Foreign Minister Sikorsky. But also I was watching French television yesterday, and in a recent poll, over 60% of the French were in favor of making cuts in different ministries in order to fund greater defense of France. Given the French context, where people tend to go on strike whenever there is like some kind of fiscal austerity, that's quite surprising. Poland, Prime Minister Tusk has announced that they will prepare to really increase the size of its reserve, army reserve, from, I think it's 200 to 500,000 men. So, I mean, Europe is really taking seriously the fact that the U.S. seemed to be abandoning its role in NATO and in Europe. So, what is your assessment of that situation and of the role of U.S. in that context? Beyond Ukraine, but I mean, what is the U.S. saying right now is really sending Europe into, a realignment. Ambassador Freed, do you want to?
I've been listening to the French talk about European strategic autonomy for so many decades. I had hair at the start. Now they're serious because they're scared. The Germans are talking about this. The British are increasing their defense spending, having let their army deteriorate to the point where they only have 3 brigades, which means they can only have 1 brigade deployed overseas at a time. The British. Trump is right. And he, like all U.S. presidents back to Eisenhower, have been complaining about lack of European defense capability. Now, the Germans had a pretty big military during the Cold War, but they've let it deteriorate. That may be changing. Now, there will be a fight, and probably is a fight right now in Trump world, about whether that means, whether the European increase in expenditures means the U.S. can simply walk out of NATO because the Europeans have it, or whether Trump can claim the win of saving NATO with a rebalanced military efforts. I suggest the latter because it has fewer consequences and the win seems to be about equal. Others in the administration, the neo-isolationists, the Lindbergh wing, or the pro-Yalta wing, whatever, the isolationist nationalists will fight this, and this will be fought out over months. But the Europeans, if they are serious, are giving Trump the ability to say that he won. And there therefore is a case for the Reaganites within the administration to make their case. They can do it. It doesn't mean we'll get there. It means that the Europeans now have scratched an American itch, and Trump may want to take the win. Now, I'm putting in those terms deliberately because there is absolutely no use in talking to the Trump administration about the rules-based international order or Kant's perpetual peace between republics or any of the other stuff that motivates me. So you got to put it in different language, and that's fine. I'll put it in whatever language is necessary to actually get to a decent result, which I will call a free world strategy. It has left-wing, right-wing variants, but it amounts to pretty much the same thing.
Thank you.
So, Geneviève, let me just again underline Dan's point. That is, it is a good thing that the Europeans are taking this seriously. It is a very good thing that they are now seriously talking about, in particular the Brits and the French, but others as well, are seriously talking about putting armed forces in Ukraine to provide that security guarantee that we talked about earlier, that security guarantee to the Ukrainians that the Russians won't invade again, to deter another Russian invasion. And we'll see if they're serious, but so far they sound serious. So far it sounds like in particular, the Brits and the French, but others. I mean, as you mentioned, there have been several meetings, some of defense officials, some of leaders, some of foreign ministers, a lot of focus on exactly this, with the concrete result being the possible concrete result being a force in Ukraine made up of European soldiers to deter a Russian invasion. Now, you earlier raised, Geneviève, the question of, are the Americans going to backstop that? Are we going to support that European force on the ground in Ukraine with air cover, with intelligence, with communications, with anti-aircraft? There are a lot of things that the Americans bring to the fight that they could bring to the fight from their bases in Poland or in Romania or in Germany. Don't have to be on the ground in Ukraine. And if the Europeans are serious about putting troops on the ground in Ukraine, then our backstop could help describe what Dan's talking about in terms of a rejuvenated NATO.
So I want to mention to everyone attending the webinar that we have a Q&A button, so you can place questions there. And we will soon, actually, we have several questions already, but I want to encourage everyone, if you have a question that you want to pose, a general question or one specific address to one of our two guests. So maybe I will go with some of those questions. Okay, so one is from Oksana Poza. So it's a question for Ambassador Fried. In your opinion, in case Poland is forced to replace Starlink, what would prevent Musk from selling Starlink services to Russia?
I can think of two things. One, there may be in law restrictions on providing Russia with certain high-tech services. Now, I'm not saying this would apply to Starlink. I don't know the details, but it might. Second would be if we sell it to if Musk sells Starlink to the Russians, all of Europe's and I think around the world, Starlink's customers would run away because they would fear that America would also compromise their own security. Musk would probably say, no, these are separate and completely different systems. I can provide both sides, help both sides gain tactical intelligence. But I think other countries would run. And the cost to Starlink and the potential impact on U.S. defense sales more broadly would be a considerable risk. So I think those two things would work against it. Now, I'm not an expert in the technology of military export controls, and whether I'm not even sure whether Starlink would fall under this, but I think it might. So it's a fair question, and depressing that we have to actually think of it as a fair question, but there we are. I think it is less likely. Besides, Musk and Rubio feigned outrage at Radek Sikorski's accusation and said this would never happen. The quick turnaround by Musk, claiming he was misunderstood, he never said anything like this, suggests a sensitivity to being seen as unreliable. But, this is not definitive on my part. It's my quick reaction to the question, not a final one.
We have two questions by Natalie Uresco, who we're very glad that she's joining us. She was a Ukrainian Minister of Finance from December 2014 until 2016, and she participated in a symposium in December. So I will read both her questions that are specifically referring back to some of the things that you mentioned. So the first one is, how likely is it that an argument can be made that convinces the Trump administration to provide a backstop to the European troops on the ground in a ceasefire, as Ambassador Taylor mentioned, perhaps even air cover? So that's the first one. And the other one is, do you believe there's any truth to the stories about Starlink data being provided to the Russian side of the Kursk battle over the past days? Ukrainians on the ground report that their troop locations are being made known to Russia. So who wants to go first? So the first one is about...
So Natalie, there she is.
Oh, good.
Excellent.
Slava Ukraini.
Her own Slava, exactly right. And she's
You're
still muted. That's okay.
Natalie.
That's okay, Natalie.
Slava.
And Natalie, brilliant minister while she was in the government, a very strong candidate for prime minister, need I say, and let it stop right there. But I'm so glad to see it. To see now, and on the great question about the backstop, I'll just deal with the backstop. Dan is clearly the expert on Starlink, as he's just indicated.
No.
And actually, Natalie may have some thoughts on. Well, I'd be very interested in her thoughts. Natalie, on your question about the backstop, Dan's already indicated that if you listen carefully to what like Secretary Hicks has said, Dan quoted him on the NATO thing where he didn't rule out NATO because he said it couldn't be part of the negotiation, which is exactly right. It should not be part of the negotiation. He also didn't rule out providing some kind of backstop. He said no boots on the ground. Okay. We got that. No boots on the ground. But that doesn't rule out the kinds of things that we were talking about, including air cover. So I think that is still a possibility. I don't know what the probabilities are. And I'm sure the conversation is going on about that. And if it gives the administration the ability to point to a real success in terms of a real European defense force, on the ground, actually deployed, if it gives them the ability to say, we force that, we encourage that, we are supporting that, then that may up the chances as well.
Let me just kind of press a little bit. It doesn't seem that win that you just described is an objective of this administration. The European Defense Force. It just doesn't appear to be on the list of the top 10 things that this administration is attempting to achieve.
I don't know, Natalie.
I'll be happy to be wrong.
I'll be happy if you're wrong too, and I just don't know. What we do know is they've said over and over and over for a long time, as Dan just described, has gone back since I've known. But the Trump folks have said the same thing. The Europeans need to do more. They need to take responsibility for their security, and it sounds like they're doing that. And this would be, as I said, a concrete demonstration of that.
Ambassador Freed, do you want to respond to?
Well, I agree I'm with Bill on this one. And Natalie, I would say your skepticism is unfortunately well-founded. Okay, let's just stipulate that. But I'm trying to put myself in the position of one of the more reasonable people within the Trump administration making the case. And if you can make the case that this is a win for Trump and the costs are light, and he gets to prove his critics were wrong, that's a reasonable shot. And if he gets to say that he beat the Ukrainians into submission and that are now, we now control them, fine. I'll take that price. And as for Starlink giving information to the Russians, I've got no idea whatsoever. Okay. I think that would be a lot even for Musk if it turned out to be true. I think that would be a vulnerability. This is the Trump administration, so optimist as I am, I can't rule anything out.
Dan,
but I haven't heard that.
What you said about, the script of the more the arguments to the more reasonable members of the administration. I mean, how did that argument get made that we shut off the intelligence? If that doesn't accomplish any of the objectives, and it actually harms the ability of Ukrainians to negotiate. How does that fit in? I don't see. I don't. That's why I'm skeptical. I don't see.
Yeah, sure. Of course. Of course. I think, I don't know, okay? I have the advantage, I have the disadvantage of being an outsider, but I have the advantage of being old, which means I've seen stuff. And if I had to reverse engineer it, it would be something like this. The skeptics, maybe the vice president, maybe the people who had convinced Trump that Zelensky was impertinent are arguing he's impertinent. He won't play. You have to keep the pressure on him. And this is a way to do it. And it's just until he's under control. And Trump, he loves leverage, so he might have accepted it. Now, I don't like that policy. I think it advances no identifiable U.S. interest. It weakens Ukraine. It strengthens Putin. I mean, there are a whole host of reasons it's really stupid. But I think that's the argument that held sway, which means that Rubio and Walz hopefully will be in a position to tell the president, we've got him just where we want him, sir. And then they lift it. There's also a certain blowback. I think members of Congress, Republicans, are pushing, but quietly. And I think Trump doesn't want to be politically vulnerable. Now, I don't know that any of this is right. I mean, I've set myself up to look like the world's great fool if it doesn't turn out this way. Like, I recognize that, okay? I've been wrong before. So I'm not telling anybody that I know I'm right or that Natalie's concerns are silly. Of course they're not. They're real. And they are unfortunately grounded in, they have a factual basis. But I can see another side here.
Thank you, Minister Yaresko, for joining us. There's a couple questions about the rare earth or the mineral deals, and actually that's related to this other issue that you mentioned before as to you know, how can President Trump make it look like he wins or that he got something out of it? So what do you think about that deal and what it means for Ukraine also?
Well, Geneviève, maybe I'll go first on this one. I was in Kyiv 2 weeks ago. I left Kyiv on Thursday before the Friday disaster. It was a week ago Friday. So the conversation the week I was there focused a whole lot on this question about rare earths and the deal. And there was debate. My own sense of that is that it's not, it's on the ground in real life. This is not that big a deal, I don't think. I mean, I don't know how much stuff is there, how many rare earths and what volumes and exactly where they're located, but I do know it's going to take a very long time to get any of it out. And it's going to take a very long time to get U.S. firms in there actually doing stuff. So I just can't see that in real term, in actual effect, is going to have that big of an influence. That said, what you just said, Geneviève, is exactly right. That is, it has taken on some kind of symbolic value to have a deal struck, to have Zelensky and Trump, or Cebeja and Rubio actually signing something there to demonstrate, to signal that this is a partnership, and that's fine. That would be good, because getting that behind us, getting that signature and putting that whole issue and controversy behind us is important to get to the real issue, which is security guarantees. I'm sorry to keep coming back to that, but that's what needs to happen. And for a while there, that rare earth deal was getting in the way of, because the argument was, oh, if the Americans are actually there under this agreement, that will be the security guarantee. Well, that's clearly not the security guarantee. It didn't work before, and as I say, it would take a long time this time. But get that behind us. Get it signed. As long as it's fair and seem to be reasonable, then get it signed and get on to the business about security guarantee. Not discussing the security guarantee, by the way, with the Russians. It's not appropriate to talk about this to the Russians, but it is appropriate to talk about security guarantee with the Ukrainians.
Thank you. We have another former participant in our symposium on the war in Ukraine. Ian Bond is with us. He was the Deputy Director at the Center for European Reform since 2023. He joined that institute, that center, as Foreign Policy Director in 2013. And prior to that, he was a member of the British Diplomatic Service for 28 years. He was a British ambassador to Latvia from 2005 to 2007. Here he is. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks very much, and it's very nice to see you all again, and thanks very much to Bill and to Dan for their comments. I mean, I would but
your connection is unstable. I think I will read your question just because your Wi-Fi connection must be unstable, but stay on just in case. So Ian Bond is saying, I have many questions, but the main one is whether there is any evidence that Trump would put pressure on Putin. Surely the lesson of the Helsinki summit is that if Trump is given a choice of siding with Putin or against him, he will side with him. So far, that's what is happening in relation to Ukraine. No pressure on Putin to stop fighting, all pressure on Zelensky to make him unable to keep fighting back. So what evidence is there that anyone in the administration is thinking in terms of making life harder for Putin? I think that's an important question. Ambassador,
well, I think that's a fair question. And right now, as we speak, the policy is unbalanced and just mistaken. There is pressure on the Ukrainians. There is mere talk about pressure on the Russians, and this is wrong. So I think at the present, the Trump administration is tilting toward Russia. I think they think or have settled on putting pressure on Zelensky to keep that impertinent person in the box. That's probably how they're thinking, or some of them. And then only then turning to Russia. Now, I think that's a mistake, okay? We will see whether this shifts. Remember, Ian, if you've been listening to this, I've been conditional. My optimism is conditional. That is, it could work out well. Not that it is currently in the place it should be, because it most certainly is not. We need to see the Trump administration sign the deal with Ukraine, lift the restrictions, and then in its own way start asking the Russians to come to the table in a reasonable way. I don't know that we'll get there. My point is that we could. There are, just for the record, plenty of things we could do to increase the pressure on the Russian economy. We're not doing them. And like I said, there have been a whole lot of negative signs. You want a list? You know, I could give it to you. The miserable UNGA resolution, the inability to call Putin the aggressor, I mean, all kinds of just indefensible statements. That's not the same as a definitive policy shift, but I'm not going to defend those individual statements. There have been a few and insufficient statements on the other side. That is, talking about increasing pressure on Russia. 4 weeks ago, Trump was better about that. Now he's not.
Geneviève, if I could just take advantage of Ian's presence here and go back to one of your earlier questions about the Europeans, in particular the Brits, but Ian, you can speak more broadly. How serious is the British, French, and other intent, discussions, planning for a force to be deployed in Ukraine to deter the Russians? How serious is that, Ian?
I think the answer is it is serious, but at this stage, it's still couched in terms that there must be a US backstop. And so just what Pete Hegseth meant or didn't mean by saying that there would be no Article 5 coverage of European forces in Ukraine is quite a key question for the British government at the moment. Now, I suspect that actually, if it turns out that the US really has abandoned Ukraine, this question will become less crucial to us because we will conclude that we have to go and do something anyway because the consequences of Ukraine being defeated are too catastrophic for European security. But at this stage, we're still trying to rescue something from the wreckage, and the something that we would like to rescue from the wreckage is if we put our people into Ukraine and Putin decides to try his luck by attacking them, will the US cavalry ride to the rescue?
A very fair question. Just for the record, I think the Prime Minister has done a terrific job managing this. In fact, I'll go even farther and say that it's the biggest British-led initiative I can think of since Brexit. Puts Britain right back in the center, and it's doing a terrific job.
Yes, it'd be an easier job to do if the increased defense spending had come on tap a little while ago. Let's put it that way.
Yes, I agree. Okay, I'm with you, but
that's not Keir Starmer's fault.
Right. No, it is not. If we're getting close to a deal that Trump can take as a win. And Keir Starmer says, I know you'll have our back if we get in trouble, but we're going to do the heavy lifting. Trump might agree. Now, by the way, if I can make a shameless plug for the piece that Steve Hadley, Frank Kramer, and I put out on Friday, we were looking ahead. One of our, we were trying to be subtle about this, but we sort of think that there's not going to be any agreement with Putin because Putin doesn't want a deal, in which case we start having to think about what we do if Putin is stalling. And we concluded that we'll have to act unilaterally to back Ukraine. Now, I know that seems impossible now because the whole British-French force is predicated on there being a ceasefire. We didn't, but our military option was actually not that of a interpositional force or 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 troops inside Ukraine. It was area air defense on the grounds that this is somewhat less exposed and more militarily useful. And it shows Putin, the point is to show Putin he's not going to win his war by stalling. So I don't know that we'll get there. But we were trying to write a piece that doesn't assume that diplomacy will work because we're actually skeptical about it. Not that it's not worth a try, it is absolutely worth a try. And Trump's plan could succeed. But if it doesn't, we want to make sure it's because Putin failed, and then we're not begging Putin for permission to do this or that. And it may be that Trump decides Putin is the guy keeping him from glory, and decides to do something, and then he gets to claim that he's so smart he got the British and French and the Europeans to put up the military forces. Ian, I'm making this up, okay? But I'm trying to look into the future and see various positive scenarios to go for.
Dan, if I could just, Geneviève, if it's okay, let me do one last thing to what Ian just said, because I was very interested. Ian, what I heard you say, I think, but tell me if I misinterpreted, is that right now, Europeans would like to have the backstop that we're all talking about. And they even think it might come if they, but did I hear you say that if that's not there, that the Europeans, the Brits and the French and maybe others will have to do this anyway? What's your sense about that scenario that Dan was just talking about?
I mean, I think a lot depends on what now happens on the ground. But if it looks as though Ukrainian forces are starting to collapse, the consequences of the collapse of Ukraine would be so catastrophic for European security. I think it would be almost impossible for Europeans at that point to say, well, we're just going to sit and watch this happen and, not worry about it. You would be looking at probably a minimum of 10 million refugees. You would be looking at the remnants of an extremely well-armed set of armed forces that would break up in a disorderly fashion and go westwards. I think in those circumstances, whether they wanted to or not, the Europeans would find that they had to do something. This is just about the worst case scenario that I can think of. The only scenario worse is not doing something and then trying to deal with the chaos in eastern Poland and other parts of the borderlands of Ukraine.
Thanks, Ian.
I think that there's several questions in the chat about responding to your analysis about U.S. interests and asking, to what extent are President Trump's actions motivated by personal love of showmanship or his own ideas of, winning a deal, making a deal, perhaps even like gaining a Nobel Peace Prize as compared to genuine American interests. And I want to go back to something that Ambassador Fried said also about the qualification of characterization of Zelensky as being impertinent. I mean, there's a lot of gaslighting going on, right? There's a lot of things that is being said about Ukraine and not said about Russia that seems to be expressed in order to justify a specific policy of this administration. And so it's as if there's like two parallel worlds, right? One of the actual interests of the US and perhaps people working within the Trump administration to make those interests win. And then another set of priorities in which there's a reversal and the attempt to make Ukraine the bad guy or the impertinent president or the dictator. So, you know, you've worked inside those machines. And so, but for people from outside, and I see from the questions, there's this kind of disbelief that the Trump administration has its own policies and what they want to do, and they're trying basically to enact this by what they're doing. Are we wrong when we read this, you know, the situation like that?
Well, I can't say that you're wrong to be dismayed or shocked or disgusted by things that the administration, people in the administration say that are simply not true. You might be premature in drawing firm long-term strategic conclusions from that. Now, also, remember the administration is not one thing. It has an enormous spread. There are people in it who probably think that investing in Ukraine is a complete loss, that Russia is our natural friend against the Chinese, which is nonsense, but that's a view, that Europe in general is a parasite. The hostility to Ukraine also has a domestic political component because of the first impeachment debate. So there's a lot going on. And a lot of people in Trump world use Ukraine as a way to resolve the larger issues that appear to be being debated within the administration about America's role in the world. So that's all true. That doesn't mean the administration policy is set. And it's one of the question was premised on what Trump is interested in, a worldview or a win. That's my language, but that was kind of the question. I think he's more devoted to a win, and his worldview, though he may have it, is subordinate to that aim, and in which you see lies some hope, because the win for the U.S. is also Ukraine's win. If Ukraine loses, all of our problems get worse. If Ukraine succeeds, our problems take a step to the right. And you can make a very strong case about that, especially if Ukraine's win is predicated on Trump also winning the argument with the Europeans that they've got to do more militarily. So it's possible to have this come together, not inevitable. And to be fair, it's not just you, Geneviève, and other of your colleagues that look at this administration and are skeptical of Bill and me being relatively optimistic. A lot of our friends feel the same way, okay? Well, there's no percentage in the pessimism, but for Europe, no matter how the Trump administration comes out, they have to do more about defense. So either way.
Well, on that,
yeah.
I think I will bring in Aina Frolova, She served as the advisor to the Minister of Defense of Ukraine. She was part of the Reform Office team from 2015 to 2018. She participated in our December symposium on the war in Ukraine. She will join us. She has a question. Derek, is she coming in or should read?
Hi there. Yes, I'm here.
There you
I believe
are.
so. Yes,
Welcome.
yes. Yeah, thank
Welcome.
you. I'm glad to see all of you again. And I'm listening here all the discussion, and I think that you many time ask our distinguished speakers about you being inside the administration, you know better. But I think that unfortunately, William and Daniel, you've been inside in other administrations. I mean that we here also been for a long period in a trap of those, how we perceive America, and I think that at least politics in America changed drastically. I don't expect, unfortunately, here I'm on the side of Natalie Reska, and I do not expect that any type of I don't know, assistance aid will be released for Ukraine. I think rather we will see quite soon releasing of sanctions for Russia. I think in less than half a year, we will see factual leaving of United States of Europe and from NATO, which I don't think that for Ukraine is the worst case, because in that scenario, we can start to quite like a quick move to European Security Alliance, which is difficult now because of US position. But if you will just have this not so bright and not so hopeful scenario, which I just described, be in Ukraine, what you do the first now to to some kind of make the situation better in the short future, in tactical period?
Which one wants to? Ambassador Taylor, let's start with you.
So greetings, Alina. Pretty pessimistic scenario there. I'm not there yet, as you indicate, as you know. I think there is a decent chance that that military support for Ukraine will resume, and that intelligence sharing will recommence. I do hope that you're right about the European Security Alliance. That sounds, as I've said, I think that's a good thing in any case. Ukraine would be an important part of that European Security Alliance for all the reasons that you've said. So your question is, what should Ukraine do right now? I think it's moving to, as I said, put this agreement on rare earths behind it, sign it, just get it out of the way. And that sounds like what is going to happen, maybe this week. Make it clear that the Ukrainians are prepared to have these conversations, as you already have, as President Zelensky has already made clear that that's the case. Make it very clear that it's the Russians that are the problem. Highlight the Russians' problem. The Americans and the Europeans and folks that kind of analyze these things ought to be much more articulate and explicit about highlighting the Russian problems, the problems that the Russians are creating for Ukrainians, not just, and certainly including the horrible things that the Russians do to Ukrainian civilians and children and war crimes, all of that, but also the unwillingness to participate, the Russian unwillingness to participate in constructive dialogue. The Ukrainians are there. I would say that's the right approach for the Ukrainians, and we ought to, all of us, should be pointing to the real problem here over and over and over, what the real problem is, and it's Russia.
Ambassador Fried, do you have a comment on this, or I go to the next question?
Alina Frolova could be right. All right. I'm not, how can I possibly say that I know she's wrong? There is evidence for her pessimism. I don't think I'm still with Bill, but just for the record, we're looking at probabilities and peering into the fog. And I'm not going to say that her point of view has no merit, because unfortunately it does. And we may know more by the end of this week. We may know more tomorrow. Okay? So, you know, my views will change as the facts change. Hopefully in a better direction, but not necessarily. And I refuse to be one of these Americans who speaks nonsense to people in Poland or Ukraine whose lives depend on other people getting the policy right. But I'm giving it that's my best estimate as to where we are. But, you know, put everything I've said in pencil.
I have
Not ink.
another question that's moving us a little bit differently, but an important question. So the Cynthia Buckley, who's a sociologist, is writing, I appreciate the importance of seeing potential paths that could be pursued positively. At the same time, I would appreciate any opinions or insights regarding the detrimental impact of non-Ukraine specific policies on Ukraine and Ukrainians, such as the shutdown of USAID, the retreat from the World Health, what is it? WHO, sorry, and the shutdown of Fulbright. The practical impact on local NGOs in Ukraine of the USAID funding problems is severe in terms of healthcare, amplified by the retreat from the World Health Organization. The secession of Fulbright strikes another blow to soft power, but is particularly troubling for Ukrainian colleagues. Your reactions?
Well,
and that's for Ukraine and for the region.
Yes, the massive cuts to USAID and other cuts suggest the power of those in the administration who want America to turn away from its free world strategy. And Elon Musk has had, whose views about this are matter of record, has been given enormous power. It may be that that's the administration's bottom line. I'm not sure that it will be. The administration had also appeared to go after the National Endowment for Democracy. Full disclosure, I'm on the NED board. We'll see whether that holds up, because as is now public knowledge, NED has brought lawsuit against the administration. All of this bad news on U.S. assistance shows that at least part of the administration and the part that's now in control does not want America to play the role as the leader of the free world, because they don't believe in the free world. That's a pretty dark vision. But this is not the end of the road. It is possible that the administration will burn up so much political capital, it may adjust. Trump does tend to adjust when he hits resistance. And I think he's beginning to hit quite a bit of it. But this is how, you know, I'm not saying that's wrong. You know, my views that there is some optimistic variance out there are also informed by the fact that there's a lot of bad news in the here and now, and the worst elements seem to be in the ascendance for now.
Ambassador Taylor?
Geneviève, the only thing I'd add is that from U.S. interest standpoint, the work that USAID does, most of the work that USAID does is clearly in our interest. We want the United States to be more secure. And if Ukraine wins, if Ukraine at least stops the Russians in Ukraine, we are more secure. Europe is more secure. We are more secure. That's clearly in our interest. And a lot of what USAID does. So the questioner, Cynthia, talks about the Fulbright, WHO. WHO is a good example of how working abroad helps the United States be more healthier as well as more secure. There are ways that USAID is helping veterans, Ukrainian veterans, through non-governmental organizations, through treatment, that again makes Ukraine stronger, which allows them to stop the Russians, which allows them to defend themselves against the Russians, which is in our interest. The point is there are the Fulbright. So as I mentioned, I was in Kiev a week and a half ago, and on my way back from Kiev, I stopped in Lisbon, where my brother is on a Fulbright. And he's doing great work, and he is making the case for the United States in Portugal. And it is a strong, powerful case that the Fulbrighters make. So all to say that these are programs in our interest, and to the extent that Dan's right, that people will evaluate these programs and make decisions based on that evaluation, then I think they will reconsider and allow them to go forward.
And another question and a concern that we hear also a lot is whether the Trump administration's policy vis-a-vis Ukraine might also translate to or be replicated in East Asia, for example, Taiwan and South Korea. So how do you see that issue, that the signals that we are sending to China, North Korea?
Well, there are roughly three schools of thought within the administration, as far as I can identify them. One is the free world first. The second is the Asia first. And overlapping with that, but not the same, is the kind of Lindberghian neo-isolationist school. The Asia First crowd and the neo-isolationists agree that Europe is a waste of its resources. They probably agree that we ought to be pulling back from, if not out of, Ukraine altogether. But they will differ about Taiwan. The Asia Firsters believe that we need to shift resources to prevent China from taking Taiwan, which would be a major blow to the United States. The Lindbergh School, or the pro-Yalta School, probably thinks the world would be a better place if the great powers divided it up. That is a theoretical debate. The trouble comes if the Chinese actually try to do something. That would be seen as, and the US doesn't respond, that would be seen as Trump's cave to the Chinese, paralleling a cave to the Russians, and setting him up for a strategic debacle. And I think he will think twice before he puts himself in that position. I don't know. But the losing to Putin in Ukraine makes our problems in the Western Pacific worse. Though this is an issue being debated now within the administration. And just remember, there are not a lot of people in the administration yet. It's a very small group of people. You don't have assistant secretaries. There are not many. So it is being fought out now, and also with the participation of people who aren't in the administration, but who are in Trump world, with Trump at the center of both the administration and Trump world. Confusing and inconsistent.
We are at a close. I don't know if Ambassador Taylor, you want to say something or comment on what we might see this week, since Ukrainians are in Saudi Arabia. What's on the table for this week?
Geneviève, let me just say that what we are talking about here today, and I hear Dan and what I would reinforce is how to improve the prospects for Ukraine to succeed. And we can define success clearly: independent, sovereign, prosperous, democratic, European. secure, what we're trying to do is increase the probability, increase support for Ukraine's success, and trying to get inside the heads of people in this administration. As Dan says, there's only a few people who are actually confirmed into these positions yet. So I don't see the value in trying to get inside their heads. What we can do is try to find the way that Dan described. There is a way that this administration can get there. Support for Ukraine, stop the Russians, force the Russians to come to the table and negotiate seriously in ways that get to the Ukraine that we want to see. We can kind of bash people whose views we disagree with, but what we really want to do is try to improve the support, increase the support for Ukraine from Americans and from people in this administration. And I think that's what you've done here today, Geneviève, to support that is I think a step in the right direction. So thank you for this.
Well, I want to thank you both, and also to advertise 3 important events that we've organized that will continue these important discussions. So one is a lecture, Russia Beyond Putin, by Vladimir Kara-Murza on March 24th. So please make sure that you come early, because this will be a standing room only. And we will have then on April 7th, Alexandra Matvichuk, who's a human rights lawyer, the head of the Nobel Peace Prize awarded Center for Civil Liberties. She's coming and will discuss civil society in an era of global change, focusing on Ukraine, of course. So this is our annual distinguished lecture on Europe. And Kara-Murza will give the WCEE distinguished lecture. And then also next week, or in 10 days, we have Wojciech Zadorsky, who's a scholar of law and who's going to be giving a lecture on the post-populist predicament on redemocratization and rule of law restoration in Poland since 2023. And this is also related to or relevant to what we're seeing in the US now. So lessons from Poland to learn. So I invite everyone who are physically in Ann Arbor to join us for that. These will not be a live stream, but recordings will be posted on our YouTube channel after that. And I want to extend very warm thanks to both of you, ambassadors Daniel Fried and William Taylor, for taking time to share your views on what is a very important issue. And we're going to work toward actually educating people about US interests, and that US interests, as you made the case very forcefully, is for a free and peaceful Ukraine. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you again soon. Goodbye, everyone.